Hi there, welcome to this Tutor to You MCQ revision blast. Today we're looking at attachment for AQA A Level Psychology. Don't forget to check out our other webinars as well. In terms of how it's going to work, we're going to use a multiple choice format questioning. These aren't necessarily the kind of multiple choice questions you'll see in the exam. We're just using this format because it gives you a nice way to interact with the video. So we've picked out some difficult topic areas on attachment for you. I'll go through the questions. I suggest you pause the video. When I finish reading out each question, have a think about what your answer is. I'll reveal the answer and then just talk through a few points really about the answers. Make sure you keep score as you go along and see which of these webinars you can do the best on. All right, so here we go with question 1. First one, caregiver-infant interaction in humans is characterized by reciprocity and interactional synchrony. But which of these is a definition of interactional synchrony? So we've got A, an emotional tie or bond between two people, usually a primary caregiver and child. B, when an infant responds to the actions of another person in a form of turn taking. C, an infant shows similar responses to people and objects. And D, when infants mirror the actions or emotions of another person, for example, their facial expressions. So pause the video. Okay, now the correct answer is D, when infants mirror the actions or emotions of another person, for example, their facial expressions. A there is actually a definition of attachment, B is your definition of reciprocity, and C is actually the asocial stage. We'll come on to that later on. Now, just be aware you do need to know research that investigates this particular area, and careful not to go off spec here. If you're thinking about what research to use, Meltzoff and Moore's controlled observation is an excellent piece of research. Many times students try and use Ainsworth in this section and end up kind of going off spec and messing up this question. So focus for this area of the specification is really important. Next question. Which is the correct order for the stages of attachment that Schaffer identified? We've got A, asocial, indiscriminate, specific or multiple. B, asocial, multiple, specific, indiscriminate. C, social, asocial, indiscriminate, multiple. And finally D, social, multiple, indiscriminate and asocial. So pause the video. Correct answer here is A, so well done if you selected A. Now, what's important with these stages of attachment is to know the characteristics in terms of each stage, so in terms of what it is. So with the asocial, that's kind of birth to 2 months, and what infants tend to do here is they show a similar interest in humans and objects. By the end of this stage, they do start to show a preference for kind of faces and eyes. The indiscriminate stage is next, which is 2 to 6 months. In this stage, they show a preference for human company, but not necessarily any one particular human, so they can be comforted by anyone, and they don't yet show stranger anxiety. The next stage is the specific or the discriminate stage. This is about kind of 7 to 12 months. This is where the infant shows a preference for one particular person, and because of that formation of the attachment, this is where we start to see separation and stranger anxiety, and you know, they'll show that kind of reunion behaviour as well. The multiple attachment stage, which is the final stage, is kind of 1 year plus. So after you've got that specific attachment developed, that's when you can start to form those secondary attachments after that first primary attachment is formed. Okay, on to the next question. Question 3. Which of these statements are incorrect about the role of the father? A. Some argue that the lack of estrogen means fathers are incapable of forming a close attachment. B. Research suggests that the father is a playmate and not a sensitive parent who responds to the needs of their children. C. Learning theory cannot explain why a father can form a close attachment to an infant. D. Fathers can be the primary attachment figure. I'll give you a minute to think about that. Pause the video. All right, your correct answer is C. Now, this is a confusing error, and I've just kind of put that on the slide there. The reason that C is correct is learning theory can explain why a father can form a close attachment to the infant, so long really as the father's feeding that infant, perhaps then it can become associated with that pleasure. Now, A, B and D are all true about the role of the father, which is why it can be quite a confusing area, because it's saying lots of different things really. The primary area, if you like, for debate in the role of the father is whether the father can form that attachment and what the characteristics of that attachment actually are. So some research sees the father as like a playmate for the child who can't provide the nurture that the mother can. And I guess this is reasoned as being due to the lack of estrogen. However, like we said, learning theory would suggest that being as the attachment is due to association, i.e. that that feeding father can form that attachment with the child, and research, like I say, with D does show that a father can be the primary attachment figure. Next question. Which of the following sets of key terms would you associate with Lorenz's research? All right, we've got A, humanistic innate cupboard love goslings, B, evolutionary innate critical period imprinting goslings, C, evolutionary learned critical period contact comfort goslings, D, evolutionary innate critical period monkeys. Pause the video. Okay, the correct answer is B, so well done if you got B. Just to highlight here, Lorenz is actually named on your specification, so it's really important you know his research in quite a lot of detail. And it's also worth thinking about this area in the specification about why psychologists have used animals in research. So your early research into attachment was often conducted on non-human animals on the basis, I guess, that there's a biological similarity between animals and humans. Therefore, I guess the idea is if something was observed in an animal attachment behaviour, it stands to reason that it could also be applied to humans, but do make sure you know the ins and outs of Lorenz's research. Next question. 5. Which of these is true of Harlow's research? A, it supports the learning theory of attachment. B, it was on goslings. C, Harlow did not like monkeys. D, it refutes the learning theory of attachment. Pause the video. Okay, so your correct answer here is D. Some of you might have put Harlow did not like monkeys, but the correct answer was D. And just like Lorenz, Harlow is also named on your specification, so very important to know the key details of Harlow's research. Now, I can guess with Harlow's research, one of the things that we often get mixed up is what kind of things refutes Harlow's research. So as well as knowing the ins and outs of Harlow's research, you can also apply it to learning theory. Learning theory, remember, says that attachments learned through association, the person feeding the baby becoming associated with the feeling of pleasure that the feeding gives until eventually their mid-presence produces pleasure. But remember that Harlow found that when given the choice of the wire mother who fed them and the cloth mother who was the warm and soft, that kind of contact comfort, that they'd spend up to 23 hours a day on the cloth mother. So it's the contact comfort that they wanted, not the food, which is why Harlow's research refutes the learning theory of attachment.
All right, question 6. Out of these statements below, which one does not describe the operant conditioning explanation of attachment? So take a moment to read through those. Pause the video before I go through the answer. Right, the correct answer that you're looking for here is C. Now C, the infant will need to form the attachment within the critical period, is obviously part of Bowlby's monotropic theory, talking about the critical period. The reason that we've included this question is just to highlight for you that the learning theory explanation of attachment isn't just about classical conditioning. There is also an operant conditioning explanation of attachment. So if you look here, the description that we've given you in A, B and D is basically Dollard's and Miller's explanation of how operant conditioning principles can be used to explain attachment. Now, many students, when facing this kind of question, want to use Pavlov and Skinner for questions on learning theory attachment, but you don't need to. And indeed, if you do, you're really going to lose the focus of your answer when the questions are really about attachment, not about just the approach in general. There is basically enough learning theory that's been applied for attachment for you to use. Now, the operant conditioning explanation is great as there's so many key terms that you can show off with. You've got drive, primary reinforcer, secondary drive, etc. So if faced with a question about learning theory of attachment, remember, it's not all about classical conditioning.
Next question 7. Which of these best describe Bowlby's monotropic theory? So we've got A, adaptive social releases, temperaments, monotropy, internal working model. B, maladaptive social releases, critical period, monotropy, internal working model. C, adaptive social releases, critical period, monotropy, internal working model, and D, adaptive social releases, critical periods, multiple attachments, internal working model. So pause the video. Correct answer here is C, so adaptive social releases, critical period, monotropy, internal working model. And really knowing Bowlby is all about the terminology. And knowing Bowlby is very important because he's actually named on the specification twice. The critical period and the internal working model are also named. The internal working model comes up in a later section of the specification as well. I would strongly advise thinking of some kind of mnemonic technique that you could use to help you remember Bowlby, and also just to make sure you use the right kind of Bowlby, if you like, in the exam. Be very clear on the difference between Bowlby's monotropic theory and also Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation, which is actually in a different area of the specification. Next question is 8. Which of these describes the behaviour in the strange situation of an infant with an insecure resistant attachment type? So take a moment to read through those, pause those, and I'll go through the answer. Right, the correct answer is B. So if we look at B, does not explore the environment around them, stays close to the mother, high separation anxiety, high stranger anxiety, seeks but rejects the attempts of mother's comfort on reunion. Let's have a closer look at the answer. So C is secure, so that description there is a secure attachment. D is insecure avoidant, and A there is just really a mixture of the three. Now with the strange situation, there is a lot that you're going to need to cover. You're going to know what it was, how it was carried out, the results of the strange situation, the kind of episodes, what kind of things it was measuring in the strange situation, and also the attachment types. So the attachment types specifically are named on the specification. So not just what they are, but also what they might look like in case a STEM question came up asking you to identify a particular type of attachment. Next question. Which of the following statements about the strange situation is the red herring? A, one of the behaviours tested was stranger anxiety. B, the secure attachment type was the most common. C, it was an experiment. D, each episode lasted about 3 minutes. So which one of those is not true? Pause the video. Okay, your correct answer is C. It wasn't an experiment. It was an observation. And let's be clear here, especially when we're talking about studies that are named on the specification, you have to know what research method they were. Students tend to kind of go one of two routes when they're talking about research. They either tend to refer to everything as a case study or as an experiment. And it's very, very important that you understand what the research method is. You know, if it's an experiment, you're looking for at least 2 values of the IV, 5 in Loftus and Palmer's case. And of course, if you get the research method wrong, when you come to perhaps evaluate that research method, you'll be doing it incorrectly if you've incorrectly labelled the method. Next one. Some researchers have criticised research on the strange situation because A, it was a lab experiment, so lacks ecological validity. B, it may lack ecological validity. C, it wasn't reliable. D, because it was covert, there might have been demand characteristics. Pause your video. Right, your correct answer is B, it may lack ecological validity. Now, well done those of you that spotted A there and think, actually, no, it's not a lab experiment, so that can't be right. And this question is really about how much you know about the strange situation. So the first one is a statement that students often write is incorrect. And even if it was a laboratory experiment, if it doesn't inherently mean that it lacks ecological validity. There are laboratory experiments that have ecological validity. Key thing is, it's not an experiment. So this is an observational piece of research. Now, within the observational piece of research, just with C, remember, the reliability of the strange situation was actually very strong. Ainsworth had a number of people observing its behaviour. They were videotaped. The check for inter-observer reliability was about 90%, which was really high. Now, D would be true. If it wasn't us using the right word, because we've said because it was covert. So it'd be because it was overt, it might have demand characteristics, because of course the parents may have changed their behaviour in some way because they knew that they were being watched. So like I said, this is just about really knowing the ins and outs of the strange situation. Next one. All right, question 11. Which of the statements about Van ijzendoorn's research into cultural variations in attachment here are incorrect? So you're looking for the one that's not right. A, the Netherlands had the most studies. B, there was more variation within cultures than between. C, Israel had the lowest number of insecure avoidance. And D, across all cultures, secure was the most common. So pause the video. Okay, your correct answer here is A. The Netherlands had the most studies. It was the US that actually had the most studies included in that meta-analysis. Remember, a meta-analysis as well is just reporting on a number of different research studies together. And let's be clear, Van ijzendoorn is named on your specification. You have to know the details of it. So let's just think about some of the details that you might want to think about. So you might want to consider what specific questions could be asked. For example, you might be asked to comment on the results from certain countries. Now, ultimately, the findings of this meta-analysis taken together do mirror the original strange situation, but there are some really interesting things that you could talk about. So take Japan, for example. They had more insecure resistance, quite a low proportion of insecure avoidance in Japan. And thinking about how we can explain that, well, in Japanese culture, they believe in the concept of a mei, which is keeping the infant very, very close to the body. And I guess the fact that these children in the strange situation would show signs of clinginess then isn't surprising if they spend all of their time actually on their parent. Next one. Which of these summarises Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis? I'm going to give you just a bit of time to read through that, so pause it and then be ready with your answer. All right, your correct answer is A. Now, B on here is actually Bowlby's monotropic theory. This is something that I mentioned earlier. There are two parts of the specification where Bowlby is named, and it's very important for you to know the difference between the monotropic theory of attachment and the maternal deprivation hypothesis, the details of which are provided here. Similarly, if you're going to talk about the maternal deprivation hypothesis, you want to be pointing to different research. Perhaps something like the 44 Thieves would be a good one to use. Next one. Which of these evaluation areas about Romanian orphan studies would not be valid? A, real-world application, B, longitudinal, C, generalizability, or D, unethical. So which of these could we not do a good AO3 evaluation from? So take a moment just to think about it and come back. Right, the correct answer is D. A lot of students fall into this trap about talking about how unethical the Romanian orphan studies were. The key thing is that there's no direct manipulation in these studies, and this is why psychologists tend to often favour these more naturalistic methods of studies, because although we lose out on control over variables, what we gain is insight into areas that we wouldn't be able ethically to look at. So the ethical point wouldn't be valid for Romanian orphan studies. 14. Which of these describes the internal working model? So you've got three definitions there of the internal working model. Have a read through and just tell me which one of A, B or C you think is the best description, and then pause the video. All right, your correct answer here is B. Now, the internal working model in terms of the influence of childhood attachment on later adult relationships is actually the last bullet point in the specification, and it's where we see the internal working model mentioned for a second time. In respect to our internal working model, it's basically about expectations about what relationship would look like. If we were securely attached to our primary caregiver, then our expectations about what a relationship should be like will be different, for example, from someone who has an attachment type that was perhaps insecure resistant or insecure avoidant. So just on here, A is actually just a description of the the monotropy, and C is a description of the critical period, which aren't actually relevant in this area because it is just about the internal working model. On to the final question. All right, here we go. Tom and Paul have just started dating. Tom is not sure if he wants to carry on the relationship, as he's noticed that Paul can be a bit clingy and needs a lot of reassurance. Tom is a lot more laid back. He's happy to spend time with Paul and he does miss him when he's not around. However, he doesn't need the reassurance that Paul does. Which of these attachment type describes Tom and Paul? So you've got A, Tom is insecure resistant and Paul is secure. B, Tom is insecure resistant and Paul is insecure avoidant. C, Tom is secure and Paul is insecure resistant. Or D, Tom is secure and Paul is insecure avoidant. Take a moment to think about your answer. All right, your correct answer is C. Well done if you got that right. Now, it's probably easy to spot that Tom's secure, but for Paul, in classifying him, you need to think about what it would look like if he were insecure avoidant, just to make sure you got the right answer. Now, the insecure avoidant attachment types in adult relationship tend to be characterized perhaps by being a little standoffish, not seeming to be too bothered about the relationship, whereas Paul very clearly is. So just some features there in terms of the pair of them. We've got Tom, who's relatively content, he misses him but not too much, and then we've got Paul, who's clingy and tends to worry quite a bit. Okay, just in terms of a few top tips for attachment, number one is know the terminology and be ready to use it. As we've kind of gone through in the video, attachment, just like all areas in psychology, is littered with key terminology, and the examiners are going to expect you to be using it and demonstrating knowledge of it in the exam. Don't mix up Bowlby's monotropic theory of attachment and Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis. Like I said before, maybe having them written down in terms of the difference between them. Avoid that generic drop-in evaluation. You have to go beyond saying it just lacks the ecological validity. Don't overwrite your AO1. It's only ever going to be worth 6 marks, and in an essay, if you're over killing it, it's going to eat into your evaluation and your application marks. Know the spec inside out. That just means knowing what's in each area of the specification so you can know what to include in the questions. AO2 is more than just a name. In application questions, you have to go beyond just mentioning the name from the stem in your answer. And please do not forget, research methods is everywhere.